Yeah.
Creativity and change. What is the role that artists and creatives can play in climate action? So obviously, Creative Ireland, we believe there is no area of government policy that the arts can't bring something special and unique to. So one of the things we're thinking about is the role of arts and creativity in schools, in children's lives. How do we make schools more creative spaces? We also have things like Crinnean and Oak, which is 1,000 events free all over Ireland every year, designed by young people, which are to sort of express their creativity and showcase their creativity. And in the case of Creative Climate Action, we issued a call really for a partnership, because I think one of the things we've really learnt is when it comes to climate action, we are going to need lots of partnerships, lots of collaborations, and lots of networks, like we're seeing here today. So, what would happen if we brought ecologists and climate scientists, artists, and communities together, and each side of that triangle would bring their unique concerns and talents to the table. So we're not asking artists to be climate experts, but we are asking them to bring a unique set of skills. So what we have happening around the country at the moment that Zoe and Ray and others are involved in is 42 projects of different levels of scale. We are using comedy, music of all genres, theatre, dance, opera, augmented and virtual reality, architecture. There is no creative practice that is not being used, rope making, all kinds of different things, but in the service of climate discussions, in the service of getting people who wouldn't think they were maybe interested in this subject to find a way to come together and to talk about what we can do individually and as a community. So it's a really special programme. And I suppose I would say the one thing that we've been given permission to do is to fail, is to try things and go, Jesus, did that work? Or how might we do it differently? So we're very interested in hearing from people who are, I think the one thing we've learned, Ray, isn't it, that there's lots of brilliant things happening around the country. And sometimes the one thing that's missing is saying, God, you're working on that. I know somebody in Donegal, do you know that person? So half the time, I think matchmaking is really important. And the other half of the time is to get behind organisations like Home Tree, who we've been kind of keeping our eye on and who we thought are doing something really special. And there are lots of these groups around the country, and we need, as the public funders, to get behind those people who are trying to do something.
I have to say, Tania is the most amazing networker, matchmaker.
I believe in matchmaking.
You're unbelievable. I've seen you working with like you, talk to them like that. Yeah, very good. Did I see, was Crinnean and Oak behind that brilliant
Cork.
viral rap song?
Yes. Has everybody seen the Cork video?
It's in my head. So good.
It's a great rap song, and there's a wonderful guy who runs the cabin in Cork. These are working class kids from Cork, and the kids in direct provision in Listune Varna have done a rap that has had 9 million views in 2 weeks. Yeah.
The first thing I thought when I saw it, I was like, the far right are going to hate this. So cool.
But to creativity, like, is there anything more powerful than young people saying, I found my spark, I love it, it gives me joy, it makes me happy. To the theme in this room, like, isn't it wonderful when you can express your creative potential, all the great things it gives you.
I thought it was interesting when you were talking about, we don't expect artists to become experts, but at the same time, by encouraging them into a space, they often do. I don't know if you heard Dorothy Cross on the radio about 2 weeks ago. She was talking about all her family were academics, and she went into the arts. She was like, the best thing about in the arts is you can dive into any field, like really deep, and you can do it again and again and again throughout your career. So and I think what you're doing is maybe nudging artists gently in the direction of new spaces. Shane, your practice is really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about where you've come from and what you're working on at the moment? I know you're based in Leitrim, Sligo.
Leitrim, yeah. It's not going to be as dynamic as that, I don't think. I suppose like a bit like what we were just chatting about just before this started, and we were just talking about like kind of comparisons between artists and farmers, and art is a kind of a precarious and stuttery sort of career. So much like Zoe, I wear a lot of different hats, and they just have to kind of change based on what's needed at a given moment in time. but there is the kind of core practice that kind of runs underneath that, and there's the core interest that I'm into. So I was co-founder of a collective artist workspace in Manorhampton and Leitrim with 3 other artists, where we look at experimental forms of collaboration. We also do a lot of community-based projects, and most of what we focused on is on environmental grief, particularly related to a mountain that's based local to us. I've also been an artist and run art projects in Ireland and around Europe that are usually based around kind of environmental themes or materials themes, but I'm kind of mostly I think from the perspective of contemporary technologies and the overlap or the role that those play in environmental issues. So some of that would kind of come down to things like electricity usage and the kind of the very obvious things that happen with like data and data transfer and so on. But a lot of it also comes around to thinking about how technologies have been developed, in most cases thinking very much with human needs and human kind of outputs, but that if we started to think with our technologies from maybe some other kind of perspective that wouldn't be like human led, what would that lead to and what would that be? So sometimes that ties in like bits of like even Irish mythology, some of the stuff that was being talked about here yesterday with language, but it also kind of like leads to kind of thinking about material in different ways and relationships in different ways. It's nearly always collaborative practice, and I think that's kind of like core as well, because like you said, you can't be an expert in everything, but work with experts in everything. I think that I would work by that all the time. And you kind of like, you learn as you go, I suppose.
It was one of the first, we had a conversation before we were ever funded by Creative Ireland, and you had spoken about the experience of releasing artists into the world, and that you felt giving them a little bit of preparation or a grounding, and I really took that on board. And the Enchanting, some of you might know of it, I won't speak about it for that. It's a project where Home Tree, funded by Creative Ireland, have sent 6 artists and 4 or 5 support people with them out to communities around the west of Ireland to listen and to understand and hopefully creatively respond. But the first step of that process was actually to take all the artists down to Glencairn and South Kerry it was like a environmental boot camp. It was, it was farming, it was forestry, it was bogs, it was like to get us like a basic understanding. So we're not going out kind of naive, and we're going out armed with good information. So that was super. I want to come back, Shane, to some of the stuff about technology, because I know that's a big focus here is on creative use of technology, but also some of what was the name of the mountain you worked on?
Yeah, Benbow.
Benbow.
Yeah, and those 2 things kind of entangle. So Benbow is the mountain that overlooks Manorhampton in North Leitrim. And a couple of years ago, prospecting licenses were handed out for gold and silver and other heavy metal mining. And the company that got the licenses haven't a great reputation. There's been a lot of kind of trouble. There's a lot of protests. There's been a lot of trouble locally with kind of like people showing up in people's land, doing surveys when they hadn't asked permission and stuff like that. So it's a bit funny, and people are funny about it at the minute. But when me and the other 3 artists, when we were invited to work with the Irish Hospice Foundation on a grant under their Compassionate Culture Network, which is also connecting together actually like lots of different areas, rural areas, on kind of topics of grief, loss and end of life care specifically. But we asked if we could approach this from kind of an environmental grief side and talk about the mountain, give the mountain some life, and then think about the idea of a wake ritual that we might perform for the mountain itself if it was something that we were going to lose, so that people in the community could also think about that, like that kind of idea of like what would happen if you lost this thing. Judith Butler has this concept of grievability, like that the learning to love something enough that if you lost it, you you would grieve for it. It's a little bit kind of like a conceptual leap of sort of you have to love first so that you know that you would lose. So you would grieve if you lost, rather. So we put together a series of kind of like wakes. We called them Waking the Land, the project, and like a huge amount of it was just about cups of tea and biscuits and bringing people in. We have a very street-facing venue. We opened the doors. It was August last year, and we just started doing these things, and people just came in, and there was it was just a chance to converse. And then each week for a month, we had different themes that were related to the mountain, but they were undercurrents. So people kind of would make work in the space, like the people who came in, the communities, but also artists and everything would make work in the space and just engage in a conversation about a specific thing, like material. And the material is kind of important in this case because like the reason for the prospecting license in the first place is because those heavy metals are currently sourced from countries that they're considered high risk for things like becoming more zones and so on. And the reason they're needed is for connectors and technologies. And a lot of what I would work with is kind of thinking about e-waste and reusing technologies, recycling things that can still be used, because there is an awful lot of like still usable parts even on things like phones that get thrown away. Like, so yeah.
Very good. I'm really interested in that idea of it's not how you phrased it, but like grieving the loss of a mountain. Slieve Callan is the nearest mountain to my house. It's about 7 kilometres south of here, and even since I moved to Clare in 2001, even since then, New Conifer, all the old place names are things like Boolies. They were old seasonal pastures and stuff. And now when you look up at it, and I'm not making a value judgment on these things, it's wind turbines and it's coniferous forest all over. And I often think nobody ever, I'd imagine people in the town say, we never asked for that. I'm sure they accepted that change was going to happen, but now the mountain is radically different, and maybe radically different forever. And I'd be fascinated to apply that same process of listening and hearing the perceptions of a loss of an important place. Or maybe not everyone sees it like a loss of it.
Sure, but what came up a lot with that is like also people didn't kind of like, I think that they'd almost forgotten the mountain was there in a lot of cases. Like, you know, a lot of the local people who came in, they're kind of like, oh, it's Swamp Benbow, it's just there. But even when we were showing bits, clips of video and stuff from when we walked the mountain, I mean, part of the research process was continuously walking. Like, I could talk about this project for hours. I mean, there was a lot to it, but like that was, so myself and the other 3 artists, we continuously went up, and the sheer aliveness of the place was actually really important to us. And from a distance, like any mountain, it looks like a big dead rock. Like, it doesn't move. You don't see it. There's no wind turbines or anything. You know, there's nothing, there's no activity. But when you're up there, there's skylarks everywhere. Like, you know, there's bumblebees everywhere. There's heather all over the place. There's a lot of aliveness that you don't see from a distance, and there's kind of like something to that. And trying to translate that as an artist into a space.
I always say this, saying like observation is the beginning of devotion. You really have to look at something first, and then a while later you go, geez, I love that thing. You know, it's like going up the mountain and seeing the heather and the bumblebees. Zoe, what do you do? I know what you do right now, but what was it? Will you talk a little bit about your background?
Yeah, because I guess it was kind of different from other people. So I actually started in psychology, and a lot of this was just wanting to do something good or help people. But I guess with psychology, you realize pretty quickly that you're always going to be working with one individual, and actually the system that we live within is often causing those problems or those emotional issues within society. So then I got really interested in social policy and being like, can you change the actual structures of how we live, and especially around like class and equality and things like this. And I did an internship with the Scottish Government, and it was using systems thinking and design workshops to bring in, like, there was maybe 30 different organizations in the room, and people were from like frontline workers all the way up to government kind of ministers. And the whole point was posing these different questions and getting the plurality of different perspectives, and using this to kind of chart, well, what is the system, what's maintaining the system that we live within, and what is the niche, like is possible to change. From this, I got really into design and using creativity allows more people into the conversation, because it's no longer just experts. You're kind of shaping something together and co-creating, and then people can play with that or try and alter it or see new ways, kind of breaking the old rigid patterns. So I got really into design and did a master's in design. So this is a lot of like making participatory workshops and all about participation. So I do a lot of visioning with communities, I guess. So I've used audio walks and things like this, so you can share different perspectives and like listen to something and really reflect on it. And then you come into a space and you kind of work through, okay, what would my priorities be? What is our vision as a group? So yeah, I think I love the policy, and I think what you guys do is so important.
And we think strategic design, so he's talking about, like, oftentimes people think about the arts and artists, but actually some of the most interesting climate work we've seen has been led by human-centered designers, strategic designers, people with those kind of skill sets who are really good at mapping and imagining and helping everybody have their say. Really powerful.
Yeah, and it's just facilitating that energy. And for me, I guess policy does take a long time to shift, so actually I kind of changed a little bit and started working more at the grassroots. So I do a lot of community development work, because for me there's just so much engagement and joy, and you can just see things happening straight away. But I think you have to work at all these different levels, which is kind of why it's interesting being on this kind of grassroots to policy. So that's kind of bits and pieces, yeah.
We've been lucky enough to work with the studio. I'm going to give them a shameless plug. They're called Sales Studio in Limerick. Maybe some of them have been around. Yeah. And to me, it's all new. It's like this idea of design anything, design everything. Like they'll do your graphic design, to design your house, to design your strategy, your brand, everything. And there's all kinds of cool interactions between each one, and it's been cool. And that's what my rough understanding of some of the work you do is about designing futures, not just taking a cut at it. It's like, no, let's put in plan a vision and then a plan to get there. Like, and so that's what I'm really excited to see what comes out of your work with Dean Shannon, because you're based in, maybe you could say about what you're doing now, because you're doing a few different interesting things now, and have done different interesting things, say maybe like from the Killarney Cup to
Yeah, so I guess the two big projects, I'm working in Kirkagwina on two projects. So one is Ginshanicus, and I'm kind of focused in on Clahan and Brandon in particular, because I think often when we think of the uplands, it's really thinking about the farming communities. But this community, there's such a strong kind of hill walking ecology, the farmers themselves and the community council. So trying to see how everyone uses the uplands and what like the different perspectives are going to be for the different types of futures. So that's kind of the plan, to bring in all these different perspectives on this one, and then see, okay, if everyone, I mean, hopefully it's going to be an audio walk, but it does depend on how the community react to that, or if there's something else that they prefer, it might shift over time.
I knew I had a question. What's an audio?
Oh yeah, good question.
What are they?
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It's similar to a podcast, but basically you put in, it's an MP3 file, so you listen to something. But I guess it's more
while walking.
Collectively. So it can be collective, it
individually
can
or
be
collectively?
individual,
Yeah.
and it can be facilitated with the facilitator. It can be individual by yourself. But basically, you listen to something, and it can be super theatrical. Like there's Janet Cardiff has it, so you're actually watching a video at the same time. So you're watching the difference between your real environment as you pass through, and like this theater like show happening on your phone, and then you kind of interact between the two. When I do them, it tends to be more meditative. So you kind of walk through, but then you're asked to stop and like think, or maybe write down something. So you're always kind of reflecting on your own experience compared to, say, it's an interview, so someone else's life experience. And then you can kind of end it different ways. I like to do it as a workshop at the end, so then you have all your individual journeys and you come together to kind of share.
Or you can do it individually. I think the artist Rian Neil in Connemara just did it along a route in Connemara, and there's a QR code, so you're walking down the Boreen, you scan, you either play it on your phone or you put your ear pods in, so you can do it individually.
Yeah.
One of the things we said briefly beforehand was that we're not up on the stage to say absolutely there's a role, but at the same time I'm interested for creativity and how it relates to change. So I might ask you for if you have case studies that you're like, I think there's a clear cause and effect thing here. So maybe think about that for a sec, the like examples of where you feel creativity has created some change. But I'm interested maybe in what the room thinks, just a kind of a law of Asuas thing. Who believes that creativity has a clear enough correlation to change?
An audience of converted.
Work is done, but I'm about correlating. Cool. So yeah, and maybe you've got a harder job. So and actually, I'll give this question to the audience as well. If you have stories yourselves, or where you're like, this happened, and then it seemed to be that this followed on as a result. Look, it doesn't have to be rock solid, but your own takes. Tania, you've done some amazing.
We've been thinking about, I suppose we're now asking ourselves the question 5 years in, if we as Creative Ireland were to stop, would the Department of Education think it was important that creativity had a role in schools, in how we educate teachers, in the design, literally the architecture schools, because that would be our job done. And similarly with the climate action piece, I mean, our projects are between a year and 2 years, but actually success would be, God, Ray and all these people here now have fantastic connections. They'll go on and bring all of that network into something else. So to me, when I think about the creativity and the legacy, it's like, it shouldn't all be that somebody's coming in with resources. It's like, if you've done your job well, you've actually created a lovely little ecosystem that'll go on and flourish. So flourishing has to be empowering other people to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it really is a human need, and so often we're kind of taught that you're not creative or your mind works this way. We all have different types of brains, whereas I think the point of these, to have such spread out projects, is that everyone can kind of nurse their own inner creativity.
Absolutely.
And then that continues a lot
Well
past
beyond
one project.
Yeah, like the role of arts in death, dying and bereavement. Like we think there is something about that creative expression at end of life that's really, really important. But now that you've done those workshops with the Hospice Foundation, that'll probably affect your work in all kinds of ways for many years. You know what I mean? So I think, I'm sure you all have various experiences of that. So yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
But there's lots of experiences in the room and lots of different perspectives here. You know, I think that's what's come through from the other conversations.
Yeah. Do you have any correlations or case studies, Shane? Do you think we're like, I think something changed? You really don't have to.
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, I'm trying to think it through because like, and I think we all three during the day spoke about this a little bit as well, like that it's kind of hard. It's like a lot of these things. It's very hard to prove the effect of something like art, and there are ways that people do it, but oftentimes it comes down to things like audience numbers and feedback and response to social science surveys and so on, which are good, but they don't always tell the whole story, because like sometimes these things are about this is culture, right?
Yeah.
So we're not, history didn't already happen, it's happening, we're in the middle of it, and what we look at now is folklore and stories and tales and art and everything from 200 years ago, that we kind of like bring into today. What people are going to do in 200 years' time is they're going to look at what happened today, and that's not just the big things, but also the small things, like local stories, things that have kind of like developed from projects like this or other projects, and you don't know which ones will live, which ones, but they'll be there somehow. And the legacy of those things is impossible to measure, because there's no way, you can't zip that far into the future, even on a 10-year measure, never mind a 200-year measure.
One of the things that strikes me as I'm asking you the question is like, you know, change is probably a word that's impossible to define. You know, what is it? And we actually all know 100% that conversations we've had, or films we've watched, or songs we've listened to have changed us, or we've been talked to in a way that we feel different going forward. That's changed. Like, that's changed it. And we know, like I know from, say, farmers Home Tree I've worked with, I know their perspective, having worked with us and gone through a process and started to trust us and build relations. Their perspective on their farms has changed. My perspective on their work has changed. So in that sense, of course, change is happening. It's changing. Everything's changing all the time in all of us and all around us. But I suppose I was probably framing it like, oh, what big picture! Like, and forevermore, the town was climate conscious.
I mean, we often don't talk about like hope enough, that sometimes if you do a sort of a creative climate action project and you ask people, they say, well, I feel more hopeful, or I feel like, oh, I'm part of a community, so I might take that action now. And how do you quantify hope? That's a hard thing.
So was there anything that jumped out at you? Because I know before you still find it hard to identify as an artist, I think, don't you?
Yeah.
What do you think of yourself, as a systems thinker, a systems designer? So maybe there's more expectation on someone like that. Well, that's your job. You need to deliver the change. Have you seen it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess it would be, my background was kind of systems oriented design. But I do think when it comes to change, there is a role for quantitative, so like the numbers. You can see some trends, like if suddenly everyone's dropping off and like leaving, then you're kind of like, okay, there's something here. But when it comes to, it's really the qualitative or the reflective learning, and the bit that like Jenny does for the Dinshanakas project. Because you're not going to know what you're really looking for or how something emotionally impacts an individual. Whereas if you have those kind of open conversations and are talking about it rather than trying to put a number on it, then you can kind of sense or get like a better sense of it's a more holistic side of it.
Yeah, that's Jennifer Hearn. She's sitting in the second seat there. Is the, I think we call you the project anthropologist, which sounds weird, doesn't it? It's like we're studying the humans of the project. But your PhD is in at some level change. Have you tried to dig into metrics around this, or have you like just tried to
measuring?
Yeah, change measuring.
Yes, sorry.
I was just thinking about it there when, just as you were talking about it, it reminds me, there's a Aboriginal academic I always talk about, and he calls climate change the 1,000-year cleanup. And he calls it that because he's talking about, in the Aboriginal culture, this idea of deep time. And when we think of change, like we have a relationship to change, kind of a Western idea, really, this idea that it has to happen. Oh, we need change now, so we must make sure it happens right now. But change is something like, and that's where I think creativity comes into it. We have to think of the long game. If what we're looking at now is a 1,000-year cleanup, then what we're doing now is we're initiating change. And I think that's what creativity does. Creativity is the spark that ignites the change. So I don't think it's really measurable, and I think that's probably where the trust and the hope comes in.
I think that's fascinating. You're running a government department and you will be audited, I assume. And
Yeah.
how do you work that? When I think the collective answer here is, we know what's happening. It's very hard to quantify, but someone obviously asks
Has
you
to, yeah.
to.
So there's sort of things you do, like we've asked UCC to go and talk to people. So yeah, there is certain sort of qual and quant. And to your point, I mean, the state, it is hard because that deep change is longer, but equally the Irish state has signed up to targets by 2030 and 2050 around emissions. And so, yes, there's deep change, but there's also the EPA's report this week saying even if we did everything that we have said we are going to do, we will fall short by 22%. So even if the state did everything it promises, and we know it won't. So I think the one thing we have been able to convince the current government is that these projects are working because we've had the independent assessment to do that. But also I think the Irish state is desperate for people to believe in this good life that's coming, to take those actions. So I think there's more of a willingness around climate action to take that risk. But yeah, there are bean counters. Like I think to your point, we would love to be doing projects of 4 and 5 years duration with people. And the EU will do that, but generally the Irish state will do year to year, or the most they'll do is 2 years. And we're in a system now where there's going to be an election in 6 months, so we can't get anything of 4 years duration off the ground. But maybe if there's a new government, you could say, well, you're going to be here for 5 years, would you commit for 4? So I think we all have to talk about the need for longer, absolutely. But as a country, we have reductions to hit. So yes, targets.
I think, did I see David Teevan in the room?
You did.
Yeah. Do you have any input on that, David? I think you were at our immersion week in Kerry. My sense is you were relatively happy with the expectations we were putting on the artists, that we weren't loading them up to be like, once this is done, we need to see, change in the rural uplands of the west of Ireland. But is that a correct assumption? And B, do you have any kind of response to what you've heard up here? Because I know you've also been involved in arts administration through your career and have a PhD in something quite similar. So
Yeah, my was a lovely invitation to come to Kerry, and the immersion was amazing. Some parts of the encounters I would have been familiar with, but other more scientific I wouldn't have been. And time is such a key factor in durational, dialogical, social engaged art projects. And too often, as Tania, you were saying, too often it's not even a year; it's a 6-month duration, and the expectation on the end is for something that is defined. And I think the lovely thing about this project, from what I'm reading, is that the artists have been given time. It's over a longer period, and the expectation is to be the spark for change. And I think this is a lovely invitation to the artists, and it's very courageous of Creative Ireland, I believe, to fund this. And in talking to all the artists, there was a sense that this is going to, just by the very nature of their practice, this is going to impact their work, and in time it will feed into things that they do. And you'd like to think that with the encounters they have with the scientists and with the local communities, that will also be the case. And to leave it at that breadth, I think is really courageous, and I think that it will lead to change. I firmly believe that. I'm also involved in in impact measurement within an arts context, and I feel that that demand on the arts is, as you were saying, Shane, is just it's very hard to quantify what the arts are doing. It's important in one context, but it's very, very hard. So I think this project, the outcomes will be happening for years to come, and as Jenny was saying, maybe millennia, hopefully.
I mean, there may be academics in the audience, because one of the things that struck me in the last year is there's a lot of European and national funding around different aspects of climate research. So, for example, one of the projects we did, which was the Line of Light at the Spanish Arch in Galway, was actually really helped by a Trinity team who were studying sea surge rises around the coast. So one of the things that we've really learned is there's all these sort of researchers in universities who have a lot of expertise, and they've all been told you've got to get out there and engage the public in your research. And then we've got artists who are looking to make those connections. And it's been really brilliant having somebody like Dr. Roseby who lives and breathes sea surge data. So the artists wanted to do the line of light, but Zoe knew and could talk to people in Galway going, this is based on IPCC data. The line is here because in 10 years' time, the sea will be here. And she said it from a position of knowledge. And I think there's something really powerful about bringing the experts in.
Not just powerful, like essential, and not just from our point of view, from those groups' point of view. Often the scientists need that ability to evocatively convey their messages, which are often quite clinical. And the artists need, as we did down in Kerry, like just better information to go out there in the world and make powerful statements with.
Just with regard to, how are we making an impact, there's been like really good examples, even this week with Sean Ronayne, who's here, but he's
there.
Yeah, in the room or outside.
I just listen.
And I worry about Sean Ronayne or Robin Wall Kimmer. The world's attention are on these. So Sean Ronayne, RT, he's spent his life devoted to birdsong. RT came and told his story. And in every conversation I'm hearing now, people are talking about this man who's made them see the world different. In the same way as Robin Wall Kimmer, one person in an academic university just focused on fungi and just makes the world change. So we have these, or even Owen Dalton, Joe Keenan was one of the key speakers, an former director of National Conservancy, was here because Owen Dalton had talked about his spot of forestry in Beara. It was in the New York Times. And then, people see it. So it's the two things. It's the expert or the artist or the observer, really, who sees a particular place, communicates it, but then they need a platform. And it's rare that an idea like this gets onto RT or gets onto New York Times. I mean, these are exceptions. Like, again, William Bach had a project where he put up words and scribbling images to make us think. So it's the artist can do the thing, but are they just doing it in a gallery? It's that idea, can we get the images or the music or to a wider audience, because we know it'll have an impact when they do.
I think what's important, Moncan, I think we do need to tell that story. I think people like Home Tree are really good at telling that story. I think there is something about scale. So sometimes if it's one fabulous project, we find it hard. But when we can say there are 42 projects, that lifts it. But I think what's happening in the Maharees is so unique. I'm always very curious that there's a lot of international interest in what's happening in the Maharees, and half of Ireland doesn't even know what's being done in the Maharees. But maybe when the New York Times will cover the Maharees, all of a sudden Irish people go, Jesus, I better get down to the Maharees. So sometimes we're looking at how do we tell the story internationally? How do we film it well, photograph it well? No more than that beautiful exhibition, I don't know if people saw it, of Tina Claffey's photos from the bog, the macro photography, making sure that this may seem a bit facetious, but are we investing in good films, in good photography, in telling our story, like you guys do through Instagram and all of that? That brings us, a lot of you probably came to know Home Tree through some of its social media first.
And I have some insight to that. Matt actually brought way more of that to me because he had been publishing a magazine, probably with his 10 year maybe. He'd been and he's tuned into that. He's like, sometimes I'm like, stop stressing over the location of this, the logo or how he's like, this is really important stuff because it lands and it gives people a perception of who you are. I was just to stick on you, Manca. Do you see yourself in the technical side or the creative side, or a bridge between the two? I was interested to hear you say last night that Dahi is stuck in the archives, but you tend to use the Changlon or these, you're kind of a bridge between both worlds. Are you a creative or a researcher, or are you both?
Yeah, no, I'm not a researcher. I'm a good person about putting things out either through social media or radio or TV or podcast, and I just see there's a million other in this room there's so much expertise, either on place name, on grasses, on everything, and it's just getting those out. I'm very good about getting my message out, but all the other people could be supported, because it's just they don't want to do what Matt and I do, whore ourselves on social media. Or make it like the new film that Merlin Sheldrake has done on fungi with York. That it's about that level. The expertise is all this information has been in the minds of academics, it takes the artist, and again, Blue Grave Films, director here, getting those stories out in big movies, but also like that. The poetry on the Dart years ago was a lovely idea. What is, because we can't rely on RT and the Irish Times anymore. All their funding has just been cut back. So what other ways do we? And is it social media or other ways of getting these little stories? And most of what I love is drawing, photography. Artists need to draw, and that's great. And musicians need to do it if we can bring the ideas into those artworks.
Our a friend of Home Trees, Maria Conway is her name. She's a forester, and she's actually retiring from Western Forestry Co-op as their CEO. She's a brilliant person. She's planted thousands and thousands of hectares of forest, a lot of it native forest. She says, I mean, ye feckers are getting all the attention and you've got 200. We're better at telling our story. They're so busy putting
There is a responsibility to tell the story. Like one of the things we think about is where could we bring the artists that they wouldn't normally be visible. So like Eamon Ryan has the Climate Stakeholders Forum that we stumbled across, that there was like 200 people coming to the convention centre twice a year. We're like, we want to be in that. You know, where else is the government is talking about climate at the ploughing? Our artists at that climate and the ploughing at the Government of Ireland tent. So for me, it's also about, we were approached by the Institute of Directors, which is a very business-led organisation. And they have charter directors on the boards of the top companies in Ireland. But we were blown away that they said, we want to do a creative project. We want to explore our creativity as charter directors through the medium of design. And we thought, well, wouldn't that be interesting to have that group? They're not normally at these kind of conferences. So where can we get these stories where we're not normally, people like us are not normally there?
Great. Lads, I promised I'd put it to the room, and there's probably another talk starting in a couple of minutes. So is there questions or points based on anything you heard?
Hi, I'm always curious to ask, how do you fill the well on the hard days, if you have any strategies?
I go for walks. Really? Like, yeah, I go for walks. That's the best way. There are some hard days though. Jesus.
I also go for walks in a walking club, so rather than on my own, but I also remember what gives me the buzz is seeing the projects and seeing the impact. So remembering, to your question, having done something before or observed something that really, you know, had an emotional connection with people, and that powers me on.
You almost feel, maybe you all feel like this in a good space about the environment and climate, which we all know we're in a very treacherous space about. But in terms of, this is a complete step change in terms of support, say for your organisation or your job, Shane, my job, are all now starting to benefit from funding. Maybe it's not enough, but things have changed from that point of view. That must make people feel a bit better about the future.
I think when you look at the overall system though, you can still feel very overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So it's so nice to have that sense of purpose and to feel like, okay, this is actually getting funded. I can it's not all voluntary. For so long it was just voluntary work, and it's nice to have that niche. But I think when it just feels like pushing something like a rock up around a lot of the time. And I also do the sitting in a bog, or like looking after a bog. There's one part and it's being destroyed with rubbish, so me and a friend just go and like pick it out. Because then again, it's such a micro little action, but you're trying to care for something and you're continuing a relationship with one place constantly.
It's interesting.
And kind of speaking a bit to what's sort of come up a few times there as well, like, I mean, I think also, it's one of the very lucky things. I'm very lucky to be able to practice as an artist, and it's not a privilege that a lot of people get, and it has bad days for sure, but there are great days when, like, you know, a project goes particularly well and people really respond, and those things that can, as we were saying, they're very difficult to quantify or to qualify, but like, you just know something's gone right, like that. I mean, yeah, it's funny. Like, I mean, you don't really know who you reach. That's actually thinking about this whole thing of getting like messages out in a large way. It's not something I think about a lot because I often work on very local stories. So the same project could be done in a different place, but the different place would need a new analysis. So the Benbow project, or the Northumberland Wildlife Trust I worked with on a long residency project, and kind of like that woodland there, that story that I told with that woodland works there. But if I was to do something here with Home Tree, it would be a different story, even though it would be very similar sort of material. But the things I do kind of like feed off are those kind of like moments when people respond to an artwork, or when people just come and engage in some way and seem like they might kind of take something away. There's sort of like these little bits of hope. And I think you can kind of hold on to those too. I mean, sometimes also going for a walk or sitting in a bog, I find myself going back to those successful moments, those things that just went right as well in the last few months.
There's I remember meeting an old vet in Cork before, and he was lamenting I hope it makes sense as a point. The lack of diversity in cattle's diet these days, because they tend to have reseeded fields with only the most productive grasses. And he was saying, when you lead a cow up what used to be called like the Long Acre or whatever, the road to the milking parlour, they'll dip into the hedgerow after at different times of the year, different things, because the willow might have more zinc in it at different times of the year, and the cattle know what they need. They self-medicate. They say, I need a bit of this and I need a bit of that. And I really do believe we self-medicate as well with access to nature. We go to these, we gravitate, what do you do on a Sunday morning? We just went into a woods, why? Because at some level we know it's a thing that makes us feel good or feel better, and it's not the cure of all.
And hopefully coming here to Ardna Cullen makes people feel better. Make me feel better.
Unless there's any other points or questions, I think we can wrap. Is there anything waiting out there? Great, the next talk. Sorry.
Just one little point, that keeps coming up over and over: the importance of gathering.
Mm.
And how significant that is for change,
Uh-huh.
and how the interconnectedness of people in whatever circumstance that is, the reasons or the way that farmers used to gather has changed so dramatically, and the opportunities for gathering is so much less. But also when you're actually creating change or trying to create change or make change, the opportunities to gather are so important, because that's where the sparks happen, and that's where the cross-fertilization of different projects happen. And I'd just love to make a suggestion to Home Tree that we, at some point over the next day, that we have an opportunity to suggest to each other in some kind of way, creatively on a board or something, that you put something up if you want to connect with somebody, or you want to suggest something or offer something.
Great.
That we do that. You might meet the person in the room, you might be shy, or you might not.
That's a great idea, Roisin, because we did that at Boris. We did where we brought all these people together to Boris. It's just the wall of offering. I'm offering to do this in Donegal. Anybody interested? That's a great idea, and that's dead easy.
Do you ever feel that you're ultimately funding connection?
Yeah.
Because even within this room, I'm looking at loads of people. Say you Roisin, William. I didn't know you a year ago. I'm delighted to know you now, and I feel there's all kinds of exciting potential futures ahead for all of us. And that happened through you, like that. That it's creativity is one frame, but connection is another.
Connection is a huge thing, to your point, Roisin. Like, I don't know about you, but it's been a bit difficult time for me the last few weeks, but I'm going to leave here feeling really connected, having met all kinds of interesting new projects, and I think
Even
that's what
more connected.
Yeah, that's what we're all here for, is back in the
Getting
town.
tapped in the wrist from the back of the room. Gurmil Malin.